Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and in this video, we'll be looking at some of the security aspects of Microsoft's SQL Server 2008. More specifically, we'll be looking at these 6 areas. We'll look at the authentication modes. We'll talk about logins and users. SQL Server uses the concept of roles, similar to the way Windows uses groups to group users for assigning permissions. There's a built-in system admin account in SQL Server known as the SA account. We'll talk about that. There are various other built-in accounts in SQL Server, such as the SQL Server service accounts. And then last, we'll get into schemas, where we use or look at schemas as a method of grouping the various object types under SQL Server for easier management. But here, let's start with authentication modes. All right, let's jump in and talk about authentication modes. Now, I'm just going to demo this for you because it's not a huge topic in and of itself. It does have some significant ramifications, though. But the basic idea is you have 2 ways of authenticating users in the SQL Server realm. I've been using Windows authentication, and that is going to be the far more common model anytime you're in a Microsoft environment. Now, if you're in a mixed mode environment where you've got non-Microsoft clients on the network, that's the primary time you're going to see something other than Windows authentication. Here I am going into just the Management Studio. Now this is just one interface, one client application that I can use to interact with SQL Server. So let's clarify that as well. So this authentication model will apply to all the different clients or attempts to access data from the server. But this is the tool I'm using right now to log into the server, but there are others. Authentication, in this particular case, I have a drop down, and I can choose between Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication. I'll go ahead and stick that in there, and if I remember the password, type it in, click connect, and it should blow up on me if it's acting the way I want it to. It did. Login failed for user SA. Why? There is an SA account, system admin account. It's the built-in SA account. I haven't disabled it. I haven't renamed it. But when I did my installation, I did not enable SQL Server authentication, which is a good thing, right? You don't want people to be able to switch back and forth and log into your server in any way, shape, or form that they choose. You want to control that. So as part of my installation and part of my system configuration, I set my box to only allow Windows authentication. Once again, what is Windows authentication? The OS, in my case, Windows 2008, is verifying users, and then SQL Server just takes Windows at its word. All right? So I'm going to click connect. Going in with my Windows authentication, logging in using the same account that I'm logged in under Windows, which is simply administrator. And then I'm in. Going in for users and logins and all that stuff, which we talk about in another segment. Administrator has been added as a login, just like any other account. I also have my MDM account we talked about in another section. If I right-click, however, here at the top, on the server instance and go to properties. If I go to security, here's where I can change this after installation. So I made the choice during the installation to go with Windows authentication because, like I said, it's going to be far more common. I am in an all Windows environment. I'm actually using a domain controller. But I could switch my server here to SQL Server and Windows authentication. That would allow me at login time to choose which authentication mode. So here, let's just play around with it. Right, have a little fun. Click OK. Some of your configuration changes, well, only made one, right, will not take effect until SQL Server is restarted. So I'll click OK, and I'll get out of here. So I got out of the Management Studio, but I also want to restart the SQL Server Engine service. So here, if I go to Start, SQL Server Configuration Manager, if it's not on your menu here, you can get to it via your All Programs. But this service needs to be restarted. Just right-click, go Restart, wait patiently, and then log back in. There. Restart successful. Server's running again. Bring back my Management Studio. Click Connect. Login failed for user SA. Reason: the account is disabled. I did not plan for that to happen, but it's probably a good indication that somebody was doing their job. In the real world, you do want that account disabled if you're not using the SA account. So here, let's back out of this and let's fix that right quick. If I go to security, logins, my SA account is there, but notice the little red arrow. I never enabled it. So I'm going to right click, go to properties, and go to status and enable that login. Click OK again, get out, do this one more time. I got a different error. This time it says the login was disabled as opposed to the other stuff, which really was saying that it did not recognize, had not enabled SQL Server authentication. But now click OK, and I'm in. Right. So two things: I had to restart the service after changing that option, but then you do want to make sure that account is enabled. And that's the case with any account. I could disable any account under SQL Server, and by default the SA account is disabled. So I'm in using SQL Server authentication. In order to access SQL Server, we need to create two types of accounts. There's an actual login and a user, which are, in some ways you may say, what's the difference? But in the SQL Server world, a login gets you into the server, whereas a user is associated with access to a particular database. So a server login is created, and then secondly, a database user account is created that maps to that login and is associated with a specific database. But here, let's actually do it. So looking at server logins and database users, I'm going to bring up my management studio for the quick and dirty way of getting in and looking at that. So I'm logging in, so somehow or another I have what I need to get in here, right? Notice in the main folder I have a security folder, and then under databases, if I look at, well, Veronica's is an easy one. Let's grab a system database just to be different, right? Under the master database, I have a security folder. Under the model database, I have a security folder, right? Under every database that I create, it has its own security folder. If I expand the two of them, notice there's a little difference, right? Under the server security folder, I have a logins folder, but under the database specific security folder, I have a users folder. And if I expand logins, I can see, and we've seen some of this in other segments where I talked about the different built-in accounts here, but I can see the logins. Logins give me access to the server. So these all are accounts that will get me into the server, but not necessarily give me access to any of the resources on the server. So for example, I have a user account, MDM, which is part of Mel's domain, which I've actually blown away that domain, so I have to recreate that. But I could then add that login or associate it with a user on the database, Veronica's database, and that would give me, or actually give MDM, access to resources within this database. So here, let's do a little cleanup. First of all, I've actually destroyed and recreated my domain controller. So that account is no longer there. So here, let's delete that. Get this guy in sync with my domain controller. That's totally fine. Get rid of that, and we're going to re-add it, but we're going to re-add it the proper way. Just kind of minimize all this because it looks nice if I do that. And I'm going to jump over to my domain controller. So I'll go to Start, Administrative Tools, go to Active Directory Users and Computers. Now, a lot of SQL Server administrators may not even have access to this, but let's assume you do, or somebody you know and who trusts you let you get in here, right? So from here I can go to Users, New, User, and just give it a name, creating my MDM account. The full name is MDM, real descriptive. Set the basic properties such as password never expires, is probably all I need for that. Give it a password, providing I typed it correctly. I've created my new MDM account, my old new MDM account. Now I could go one step further. I could add MDM to a group. I could create a group for SQL Server. Whatever I want to do to manage users and groups, that whole paradigm that you're used to from administering Windows, assuming you've done some of that, right? The whole idea is you want to minimize assigning or removing permissions from, assigning permissions to, or removing permissions from a user account, you want to assign permissions to, remove permissions from a group, and put users in groups. That rule never goes away. It just keeps showing up in different forms and variations, right? Same thing could be used here and typically would be used, but I don't want to spend too much time in that. That's getting more into Windows administration than it is into SQL, but just wanted to point that out. I'm going with an MDM account for now. However, you would probably want to, I'll just kind of start the process. Right click, new, group, create a group, put MDM in the group, and then assign that group possibly back into my SQL Server. But I'm going to go directly with MDM for now. So I've got my account, and close that out, move back over to my SQL Server box, going to my security folder, right click on logins, go new login, hit search. Eventually my dialog comes back. It's currently looking only on the local server. Don't want to go there, so I want to change that location. Hit the location button. Prompts me to log into my domain controller. Give it a user account that gives me access to the domain controller. Click OK after I scroll down. If I click on advanced and find now, I can just peruse the list and not retype things 3 times until I get it right. And there's my MDM account that I just created, as well as other domain accounts out there. I'll go ahead and grab my MDM account. There he is. I'm still using Windows Authentication. The default database right now is master. I could leave it like that or set it to something else. I'll just set it to Veronica's for now. That's the database we're working with. We can choose other things, which we'll talk about in other segments. The server roles, what are those? User mappings, get into that in more detail. Securables, I can associate it with specific objects, specific securable objects such as a database or tables or things that I can lock down. And then status, it's currently enabled, and I can grant or deny access to the database engine. But we don't need to change any of those for now. We just want to use this as an account to get in. Click OK. And I've got a new login. If I expand my logins folder, there's my MDM account. Now, if I go to my databases folder, let's see, I didn't, if I remember correctly, I did not add this account as a user to the database yet. So I could have done that as well. Let's see, I could have, let's go back in there really quick. Go to new logins, and here under user mapping, I could have picked the Veronica's database. Had I done that there, it would have added it here as a user already, but I can also do it a second time around here by simply going new user, hit the ellipse here for logins, browse my logins, and I can find my MDM right there at the top. Select that, click OK, click OK again, and now I can give it a separate username, because remember the login gets you into the server and then it maps to a username within the database server. And I could call it anything, but for simplicity's sake, I can just go ahead and call it MDM again. Could map it to a default schema if I wanted to, specific schemas that he owns, roles. We'll get into all that in a little more detail coming up in another video. But click OK, and now that user is not just in the database, in the server, but also directly on this particular database, and then I can go about giving specific rights, permissions, etc. to that account for this database. Okay, way cool. So minimize that all back and continue on. So let's talk about database level roles. When it comes time to manage your users, you don't want to have to manage and assign or remove access to each individual user account. Typically, you'll have multiple individuals performing a role, and or individuals should be interchangeable. Nobody stays in a job forever, right? But the job could probably easily outlast the individual. Okay, so how do you separate those two? Well, you take your user accounts and you group them. Just like in Windows, you have the concept of a group. You can take a user account, put it into a group. Same thing with an SQL Server, but the only thing different in SQL Server is that you tend to, or I should say you have 2 separate sets of groupings. One is the list of database level roles, and here's the list. And before we jump into the list real quickly, the other one is server level roles. So we have roles that are specific to the database, and we have roles that are specific to the server. Because if you look at my segment again on logging into the database, there's the concept of logging into the server, and then a separate concept of having a user account or a user ID with the database. But here, let's actually jump over to a page on MSDN that does a great job of giving you all the details on all these roles, and it's something you'll want to have access to as well. So let's jump over. So I'm going to bring up MSDN, and I'm going to go to database level roles. And looks like that's it there at the top. Scrolling down, here's that same list again. And as you would expect, the very first one, owner, has all access, can perform all configuration and maintenance activities on the database. No questions asked. As opposed to your two security admin types. You have the security admin. This person can actually modify role membership as well as the permissions associated with a role. And it says they're adding principals to that role could enable unintended privilege escalation, because this is a little more latitude than the one just below it. Access admin simply allows you to add or remove access to the database for logins. So that's for somebody who's doing more of a general maintenance of user accounts, putting them in, taking them out. Then you have a backup operator, allows you to run backups, pretty handy role to have. DDL admin, data definition language admin, allows that user to run your data definition commands. It gives you a lot of latitude to administer the server. Then you have a data writer role, can add, delete, or change data in all tables, as opposed to a reader role, can only read. Sound pretty handy, right? Of course, people who only need to say do reports and never update data, don't even put them in a position where they can accidentally do it. They're in a reader role. And then you have roles specifically for denying access. You can deny the ability to write, deny the ability to read data. Now, these are the built-in roles. These are always there. You can create your own roles if you need to, and then dynamically associate them with various permissions. However, it is recommended you try and fit your users into the existing list of roles. If you find yourself constantly needing your own database roles, well, first of all, you're going to give yourself a lot more headaches than you probably want to take on needlessly, right? But you may want to look at reevaluating how you're attacking your security, because this list does tend to be pretty thorough in covering the larger set of individuals out there and what kind of roles you'll need to be a part of. Now, these database roles apply to all the databases. There are some roles that are specific to the MSDB database. Now, again, the MSDB database is the database where you're storing everything associated with jobs, as well as some other system-specific information. And it comes with a few additional roles, such as the DBSSIS admin for administering integration services, your integration services operator, as well as the SSIS LT user. So other things also associated with integration services. And then you've got some other roles. Once again, these are all specific to MSDB. And then if I scroll down a little more, it gets into another section which is pretty cool but mislabeled. It says working with server level roles. We're actually still looking at database level roles, as it says at the very top. Right, this is all database level roles. We'll look at server level roles in a second. That's a typo on MSDN. But if you scroll down, here's a bunch of store procedures and some TSQL that you can use to manipulate roles. So if I want to create my own roles, I can do it. You don't want to make that your first method of attacking problems, but if you need to do it, it's there. So I can alter a role, I can drop a role, I can create a role for my particular implementation. So here, let's do that. So here we are on my server, and I'm going to use my favorite database, Veronica's. Go, and simply saying create role and give it a name. Let's say I need a new role for my auditors. And these are the people that are going to come in. We hire them. We're hiring some big 6 or big 5, whatever they are these days, accounting firm. I need to create a new role for them. Now, just typing in F5, create it. Now, I've been playing around with this. I already have an auditor, so I'll just get creative here and call it auditors 2. Or you know what? Here. go ahead and jump to what I was going to do next. I can actually delete that as well, just simply saying drop. Right, that'll blow that away. But once again, to create it is simply create and the name of it. Now there are a lot more options I can add to this, but here, let's go in and look at it. We added that to the Veronica's database. So if I go to databases, Veronica's, go to security, and expand roles, and let me right click this to refresh it. Go database roles, and there's my auditor's role, as well as all the other built-in roles, including public. Public is always there. Everybody's always a part of it. Okay. So there's select the everyone group in Windows. But there's my auditor's role. It doesn't currently own any schemas, but we could assign it the ownership of any one of my schemas, any one of my grouping mechanisms within my database. I can also assign specific securables to my role. So if I go search, I can say specific objects, all objects belonging to a schema. So I can say give me everything, make that role in charge of, say, all of HR or all of sales or something of that nature. Right? If I went to all objects of the type, click OK, I can see the various objects. So I can say it owns all the tables and the views, or any other object type that I want to assign to that role. Now notice I clicked cancel. Why? Why am I not going to use this awesome feature right now in my Veronica's database? Because, as I was saying before, you typically want to stick with one of the existing roles. And if you look at what I have here, if these are auditors, they're not making changes to at least this data. Maybe they're recording the results of their audit somewhere else. But here, they're basically a data reader. They shouldn't require a new role. In most cases, you will be able to use your existing roles. Now, one other group I want to point out, let's switch back over to MSDN. We talked about database level roles. I want to quickly show you server level roles as well. Basically the same song and dance. You've got pre-existing roles that allow you to manage the access that users have to your server, not just your database. So you have kind of your demigod role here. Sysadmin can perform any activity in the server, which is what I'm running as right now. Typically that's not the safest place to be, but I'm in a test environment, so it's okay. Then you have other types of server administration roles. Server admin, security admin, each one with a certain set of rights and permissions, all the way down to simply public. And as I said before, everybody's always part of the public role. Every SQL Server login belongs to the public server role. So when a server principal has not been granted or denied any permission specific to that securable object, they automatically inherit whatever rights you've given to public, just like the everyone group in Windows. And as we saw, there were functions and stored procedures for adding your own database roles and manipulating the roles. There are functions for working with server roles as well. Now, you don't have the right to create server roles, however. So when you look at the list here, it's giving you the ability to add users to a server role, remove users from a server role, or find out more information about a server role. Okay, so that's another difference you'll notice between the two types of roles. These apply to the server level. The other ones apply to the database level. You can actually create your own database level roles. Server level roles are fixed. The SA account. The SA account is really a holdback to days gone by with SQL Server. It's a built-in account, system administrator account, that typically isn't as often used today. Primary reason is you're going to focus more on Windows authentication than SQL Server authentication. So you won't be authenticating with the server anyway. You're going to be authenticating with Windows. You're not going to see that used as often. And to be honest, you should disable it or at least rename it, because it's kind of a built-in backdoor where if you don't touch it, the whole world knows you have at least one user account that has complete access to the server, known as SA. All you have to do now is figure out the password, right? So you want to give little to no information away to people who don't need to have it. So, like I said, at least disable it. If not disable it, at least rename it. Okay? But here, let's actually go over and show you how to use the SA account. So let's look at our SA account. We'll go Start, Log into SQL Server. I'm going to go in as administrator right now using Windows Authentication. I'm going to connect. Expand my security folder, expand logins, and there's a few different things in here. But right now we're going to focus on the SA account. It's a built-in account. It's always there. I can right click, and a few different choices I have. I can rename it. I can delete it, which is pretty handy because the SA account is a standard account that's installed when you, or I should say created when you install SQL Server. Now, because of that, it's kind of a well-documented, well-known backdoor. Anyone trying to compromise your SQL Server database has an account that they know exists. So at a minimum, you want to rename it. At a minimum, you want to rename it. But here, let's go one step before that. Notice there's a little small, you can probably barely see it if at all, a red arrow there. That's saying it's disabled. So by default, it's disabled. If I go to Properties, go to my Status screen, and here I have a few different options. I have a permission to connect to Database Engine, grant or deny, and I have a disable and enable. Notice the login is once again disabled, so hitting here will enable it. This one here is kind of interesting. If I change this from grant to deny, it actually will flip right back. You really don't have an ability to deny it. You don't need to deny it. All you want to do is enable or disable. And then the login is locked out as disabled right now. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And I still have my little red arrow. It doesn't change until I get out and get back in. Now, if I'm going to even begin to test this, however, I need to change my authentication model. I'm currently using Windows Authentication only. So if I right click on the server name here at the top and go to Properties, and right here in the middle where it says Security, here's where I can change my server authentication from Windows Authentication to SQL Server and Windows Authentication. So it gives me the option of doing either Windows Authenticate my users and logins, or SQL Server authenticate my users and logins using a drop down on the logon screen. So here I click OK, and it says, hey, in order to make this stick, you've got to restart the server. So we'll click OK, get out of the Management Studio, and here let's restart our server by bringing up the SQL Server Configuration Manager. Now I've already been in mine, so it's already on the menu, but if you hadn't been in there yet, you'll want to go to SQL Server, go to Configuration Tools, and you'll find it right here. Okay, so I'll click on that, and here I can see, you'll probably get that by default initially, but once you've been in there before, it'll remember where you've been. And if you go to SQL Server Services, you can see all the services you have installed. I haven't installed a lot of stuff yet. Analysis services, integration services, reporting, none of that stuff is installed yet. But the things I do have installed, it gives me green for go, green for it's running, and red for it's not running, right? So if I right click on the server itself, there's an option to restart it. Wait patiently while that happens. Alright, looks like it's good to go. Close that out. Go back and restart my server. Here's my logon screen again. Hit the drop down, and I can go in using SQL Server Authentication, give it whatever password I've set up. In my case, I set one up when I installed SQL Server. I could click to have it remember that password if I wanted to, but I don't need to do that. And I'm in using my SA account. But once again, at a bare minimum, one of the things you want to do is to rename that account. Even if it's disabled, I would recommend renaming it, and rename it to something that's not obvious. SQL Server SA account. Give it a name that you and the rest of your team may know and the rest of the world would be clueless on. All right? So that's the SA account, where it comes from, when you might use it. It's like a built-in administrator account, some security precautions with it. Like I said before, by default, it's disabled. Even if you do choose to leave it disabled, which you easily could, you would still be wise to rename it. All right? So that's our SA account. So here we've covered the first few items on the list, and now we move down to SQL Server Service Accounts. We're going to talk about the accounts that are used by the SQL services, as well as some other built-in accounts right after that. So here, let's look at our SQL Server Services. I'm going to go to Start, All Programs, and it was already on my menu, but I'm taking you the long route just in case it's not on yours. Going under Configuration Tools, and I have SQL Server Configuration Manager. Once you've been in here once, it's on the menu, of course, right? But going to SQL Server Services, and I can see a list of the services I currently have installed. I have my full text search, my SQL Server engine itself, SQL Server browser, which is currently not running, it's stopped, and then SQL Server agent, which is also currently stopped. So I have a name followed by the state, followed by the start mode. And your start modes are typically automatic, manual, or disabled. Right? So currently my full text search is set to manual. My server is set to automatic, which means it's going to automatically start as soon as I bring up the box. But what we want to focus on for now is this all so important fourth column, log on as. These are the accounts that these particular services are currently using. And I'll go into my engine, hit that one. And if I go to log on, the very first tab, I have two options. I can go with a built-in account, or I can go with a Windows account. So what's under built-in accounts? If I hit that drop down, three choices there: local system, local service, and network service. Now these are here, and we're actually using some of them. However, using these is something you want to be very cautious of, especially if you're using the very first one on the list there, local system. The local system account is going to be an extremely high privileged built-in account. So if you're using that account, it's possible you're allowing much greater access than you need to for the service that you're associating it with. The next one, local service, that's another built-in account. However, this one has only the same level of access as any members of the users group. So this one is a little more limited and helps safeguard the system a little better. Now, you wouldn't want to use this, or you couldn't use this for anything that requires network access. If you have a service that requires network access, such as your replication service or something else that has to communicate over the network, you'd want to go with at least a network service account. That's another built-in account. It's going to give you more access to resources and objects across the network, and it's going to interact across the networks with the same credentials as the computer account. Okay, so those are your three built-in accounts. Now, you don't necessarily want to use built-in accounts. It's usually recommended to create your own accounts, whether they're local accounts or domain accounts, depending on whether or not you know a domain, and then assign only the rights and privileges to those accounts that are needed in order to accomplish the job. Now, right now, I'm being lazy. I'm just running as administrator. That is probably the one thing you almost never want to do. You don't want your SQL Server services running as administrator if you can at all avoid it, and usually you can. You want to create some account that gives it the rights and permissions that it needs. So to do that, all I would need to do is go here to Browse. Then I get an interface that allows me to pick a user account. I can type it in right here, but these are only looking at local accounts. That's the name of the server where my SQL Server engine is running. But here I can log into my domain controller. And from there, I can see, let me scroll to the domain. I can see, now if I do advanced, find now, I can see all the names and accounts that are available on my domain controller. Let's scroll that up a little bit. So if I want to use a domain account, here's my chance to grab one out of the list. Associate that with my engine. I'm not going to change that right now. I haven't gotten into creating one, right? I would have to actually go over to my domain controller and do that. But once I select that, I've now got a domain account associated with my SQL Server engine or any other service that I need to have domain access. Okay? So cancel out of that. The other thing to notice, service status here at the bottom, start is obviously disabled because it's already running, but I can stop it, pause it, restart it. If I go to the service tab, everything in here is grayed out except for the one thing I can change. I can change the start mode. Mine is currently automatic, but if I want to disable the engine, I could do it here. Then you have no SQL Server running, right? It's dead in the water. I could set it to manual, and then I'd have to manually start it every time I want to have the server running. So if you have a box that for some reason or another you're not using SQL Server all the time, set it to manual. That way you're not eating up resources for that service running in the background when you don't need it. All right? But for most production servers, that will not be the case. You'll want that set to automatic. One other thing I want to show you right now, just cancel out of this. Don't want to change any of that right now. And I'm just going to bring up my browser. And we want to check out a web page. We want to check out the Microsoft MSDN site because I want to show you a page on setting up Windows service accounts that summarizes and gives a lot more information, a lot more detail. So let's not do Windows 8 upgrade just yet, or Internet Explorer 8 upgrade. But I want to go to the setting up Windows services account. Here's the ticket. But this site is pretty awesome in that it gives me tons of really specific and detailed information on the services. First of all, starting with what are all the services? We only saw a few of them a few seconds ago. We saw the database engine itself. We saw the SQL Server agent. Those are listed there. But I don't remember if we had analysis services in there yet. Don't think we did. We didn't have reporting services, integration services. We had the browser service. We had the full text search. We did not have the Active Directory or the SQL Writer, but each one of these are separate services that are going to run under SQL Server that we want to associate with an account. Scrolling down a little bit more, it just reiterates a few other things I've already mentioned. One of the things I didn't mention here, though, configuring server startup type. You can configure many of these when you're doing the installation. That's what I did. So my database engine was associated with the administrator account during the install process. Same thing with full text search. It got associated with one of the built-in accounts. I did that during the installation process. So notice these 5 you can do that with. They can be configured in the installation wizard. The other things it mentions some of the different startup account types. Domain user accounts, as I just showed you, you could easily use a domain user account, or you could use a local user account depending on your environment. If your SQL Server box is in a domain, you'll typically want to use a domain user account. If it's not in a domain, you'll definitely want to use a local user account. Then we talked about some of the built-in accounts, the local service account, the network service account, and the local system accounts. And then we talked about disabling, manual, automatic. But like I said, this has tons and tons and tons of additional information that you'll want to have as a reference when you're configuring and modifying and checking on the status of your service accounts. Okay? So with that, we'll close this out and continue on. Next, I want to talk to you about some of the other built-in SQL Server accounts. Another entity you're going to run across when you're dealing with security accounts, let's go ahead and expand this again. Here's a couple of them. I didn't create these. They were already there, and they have pounds or tic-tac-toe boards, whatever you want to call them, surrounding those names, right? 2 of those. Those are special. Those are accounts created by SQL Server for managing its various internal affairs, we'll say for now, and you do not want to delete them. Here, this is a partial list of the ones that can be available. It depends on what you've installed. If I go to Server at the top here, right click and go to Properties, then go to Permissions, and I can see a list, a more extensive list of the various principals that are available. We haven't covered all these services yet. We'll get to them, but policy event, policy signing, policy T-SQL execution log, SQL authentication certificate, replication, resource signing. SQL Server has a myriad of services that are running in the background that help it to implement the various features, the various capabilities that we see in SQL Server. It does that kind of playing by the rules, so to speak, in that anything running under the Windows environment has to have a user account, passwords, rights and permissions granted, etc. SQL Server is doing the same thing, and it actually creates many of the accounts it needs as that component is installed so that you have access to those features. So here's 7 of them that are currently not all in use, as you can see over here. But that's the list of some of them that you're going to encounter. Hey, let's jump in and talk about scope. When we deal with SQL Server, it's all about managing data, getting it to the users quickly, making sure the data is secure, right? One of the key architectural components of SQL Server that helps to support that goal is the way the objects in the environment are grouped using what are known as scopes. You're going to run into three main levels or three main securable scopes, as they're called. The server itself. We talked about logins, or in one of the segments we talked about logins as the way you gain access to the server. And then the database, which requires a user account, which is separate from a login, right? Those are two different things. And then last, we have the concept of a schema, which is really nothing more than a container grouping the various other objects that are available in the SQL Server environment. But here, let's look at this. Going back to the server level scope, the securables, and this isn't a complete list. I figured I didn't want to read you the dictionary, so I just gave you a couple. But the login itself is a securable on the server. So once again, to gain access to the server, you need a login to the server. And then, of course, the database or databases themselves, because on the server you can have one or more databases that are going to hopefully be secured. Next, we talked about the database itself as a securable. And then here are some of the things you're going to encounter when you talk about securing the database, some of the securables associated with a database. There's the user account or database roles. In addition to database roles, you also have application roles, which are similar to the first category of role. The difference is they are specific to applications as opposed to users. You have your .NET assemblies, your message and routing components, services, your full text components, your full text catalog, your security components such as the certificate there, third from the bottom, and then your asymmetric and symmetric encryption keys. So all of these things related to security, related to encryption, and the last one on the list there, of course, schemas. Those are some of the things we can secure, some of the things that are included under the securable of the database. Going one step further, then we look at the schema. Well, this seems like a short list, because you're saying, well, we really haven't gotten to the database stuff itself. Well, the database stuff itself is all grouped under the general heading of an object. Of course, there's the XML schema collection when you get into collections and extensible markup language stuff. But for now, I want to focus more on the object list, because that's where you're going to spend more of your time typically. Objects encapsulate a lot of things, and that's not intended to be a play on words, but really. Your aggregates, your constraints. Anytime you create a constraint on a table, that's actually considered an object, and it is a securable that can be grouped under a schema. All of your routines you create, whether they be user-defined functions, stored procedures, all of those, your queues, your statistics, synonyms, and then last but not least, the things you're probably most familiar with, the idea of a table and a view. And you may recall, every time we go in and look at our Veronica database, it's the table names are always preferenced when you're looking in the Explorer on the left-hand side. They're always preferenced with something dot table name. Well, that something in the front is the schema. Once again, reiterating the fact that a table is a subcomponent of a schema. So I almost said fully qualified name because really it's more than just that, but a more complete name for a table includes the schema. I caught myself and didn't say fully qualified because really you could say, well, you can go right up the chain too and say, well, the database name belongs in front of the schema name, and then the server name belongs in front of it. So all of those things together, once you're inside of that database environment, it will assume the current database. It will assume the current server. So you don't necessarily need to give it those components. All right? So a few other things about schemas before we jump in and play around with them. First of all, you're always using a schema. So if you're saying, okay, I have to go learn these so I can start to use them, well, you need to learn them and become more familiar with them so you can more efficiently use them, because you're always in a schema, and by default, if you don't say otherwise, you're in the schema known as DBO, Database Owner. So any object you create, any table you create, unless you specifically say otherwise, and there's a few different ways to do it. You can do it when you create the object, or if your default schema for your account you're using has been changed from its default value, all of your schemas now have a new default, I guess I should say, and I think I have that here next. You can change your default schema, right? But if you don't change it, if you don't touch it, you're always DBO. But you can change it. In either case, you'll always be part of some grouping mechanism known as a schema. So here, you can get information about your schema through various schema-related views. SQL Server, once again, uses SQL Server to manage itself. So information about any table you create, any type of object you create, including schemas, are saved in the SQL Server environment. Now here's an example. If you look over here on the right-hand side, I have select star from sys.schemas. That's one of the built-in views under the system schema. That's a built-in schema, the sys schema. Simply selecting everything from that gives me a list of all the schemas in my environment. So if I look here, I can see a schema called, once again, my default schema is always there, DBO. And there's plenty of others. There's another built-in, actually the first 4 are all built-in schemas. The next 2 are schemas I created when I created my database specific to my needs. So I have a sales schema and an HR schema. And then everything after that is also built-in generic schemas that are already there thanks to SQL Server. So sys.schemas will give you all the information about all of your schemas. A couple of others to note, there's also a sys.serverprinciples and a sys.databaseprinciples that can give you a list of all the principal objects associated with your database, as well as principal objects associated with your server. Allows you to query that information and find out about that structure, find out about those structures to do diagnostics. So here, let's kind of play around with the schemas for a bit. Let's flip over to my server. Here I've been playing around with sys.serverprinciples and ran that. And I can see the principles associated with this server. There's my SA account, the built-in system admin account. There's the public sysadmin group, security admin, so various other built-in admin groups. So all the built-in stuff that's part of my server, plus the things I've added. I added the MDM account. That's my account that I logged in with. Currently I'm running under my administrator account right now, but I could have run under my MDM account. But here, let's do a little something. I'm going to go over to my databases folder, expand that, expand Veronica's, go to security, and I can see my users, right, in the user folder. Below that I have my roles, and then below that I have my schemas. So here I can see all the schemas that are associated with this database. Once again, there's all the built-in stuff. Get to HR, I get to see my first schema that I created, another built-in, and then the sales. If I need to add a new schema, simply right-click and I can create a new schema. Before I do that though, let's do this. Let's associate a user account with schemas. Let's bring back my MDM account. If I double-click that, notice it says here default schema DBO. Like I said before, you're always part of a schema. What I can do here is I can click the ellipse button, brings up a select schema interface. If I click browse, I can see all the other schemas available to me, the built-in schemas, all the DB admin reader writer schemas that are available. Make that a little bigger. You can see it says schema, right? So let's say I want my default schema to be sales going forward. Now if I click OK, my way on out of that. And now this account, if I were to log in with MDM and create a new table, it would default to being under the sales schema as opposed to defaulting to be under the DBO. Alright? Now currently, if I were to do that, just FYI, I'd get a, oh wait, I didn't realize I had that checked. If I didn't have that checked, it would blow up because I didn't have the rights to create a table anyway, but assuming I have the rights to create a table and checking that gives me the right, I could then log in as MDM, create a table, and it defaults to being under sales. Here, let's try it. Click OK. And I'm going to, since I'm using Windows authentication, I'm going to switch user accounts. Switch to my MDM account, go back into SQL Server. Go to my database, go to Veronica's, and I'll just right click and throw in a new table real quick. It's a pretty simple table. Right now the Veronica's database has all the tables it needs, so we'll just make up one. It's got a column 1 and a column 2 and a real descriptive information, right? And I'm just going to hit save, and before I do, notice right here already it says new schema defaults to sales. Now I could override that, right? I have authority on the database to do that, but my default schema was set to sales. So without changing that, leaving it at sales, simply hitting save, going to default name, and it looks like it came up with sales.table1 Click OK. So sales.table_1, just a default name. So by changing my default schema for that account, I've automatically changed what schema all the information is placed under. So that brings us to the end of this video. What did we talk about? We got into SQL Server authentication and talked about the different authentication modes. We talked about logins, server logins, users, database users, and roles. And there were basically three types. We had database roles, server roles, and also application roles. We didn't talk as much about application roles, but it's really the same concept, but instead of it tying to a person, it's tying to an application. Then we got into some of the built-in SQL Server accounts and finished out with schemas. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.